I was fired from the logistics empire. I built on the exact same day. My wife of 40 years looked me in the eye and said, "Your utility has expired, and I am taking everything." Stripped of my legacy and evicted from my own home, I wandered into a rundown diner just to process the profound betrayal. A sharp-dressed old man slid into the booth across from me, studied my face, and said, "You are the spitting image of my boy, but he vanished in a train wreck 38 years ago." His next 5 words changed my entire reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Joseph, 70 years old, and until yesterday, I believed I had secured a legacy for my bloodline. I spent decades building a national freight and logistics company from a single delivery truck into an absolute titan of industry. I gave my son Michael everything I never had. I paid for his elite education, mentored him in the boardroom, and eventually handed him the position of Chief Operating Officer. I thought I was securing his future. Instead, I was sharpening the knife he would use to stab me in the back. The betrayal happened on a Tuesday morning. I walked into the executive boardroom for our quarterly review only to find the locks on the corporate accounts had already been changed. Michael sat at the head of my mahogany table. Beside him stood his ambitious white wife, Megan. She held a stack of legal documents and a smug, victorious smile. Michael did not even have the decency to look me in the eye as he announced that the board had successfully executed a hostile takeover. He kept his gaze fixed on the financial spreadsheets while Megan did the talking. She coldly declared that my outdated leadership was a liability to their new corporate vision. They had secretly leveraged company assets to buy out the minority shareholders, orchestrating a perfect, undeniable coup. Just like that, I was erased from the empire I had bled for. I realized in that sterile room that they had been planning this execution for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when my guard was down. I did not shout. I did not flip tables or demand gratitude. I simply turned around and walked out of the glass doors, trusting that my home and my marriage would provide the sanctuary I needed to formulate a counterattack. I drove back to my sprawling estate, the home I had purchased fully in cash 30 years ago. I walked through the heavy front doors, expecting to find my wife Brenda waiting with a comforting embrace. Instead, I found Brenda standing in the grand foyer with her arms crossed. A manila envelope rested on the entryway table. She did not ask how my day went. She did not offer sympathy for the corporate coup. She simply slid the envelope toward me and stated that she was filing for divorce. Brenda looked at me with an icy detachment that chilled me to the bone. She told me my utility had expired alongside my corporate power. Without the company, she said, I was nothing but a tired old man taking up space in a life she wanted to enjoy unhindered. I stood there in absolute silence as she delivered the final devastating blow. She announced proudly that she had already turned our daughter Alyssa and Alyssa's white husband Connor completely against me. She had spun a web of lies over the past year, convincing them that I was hoarding their inheritance and mismanaging the family wealth. They had all coordinated this behind my back. Brenda demanded that I vacate the premises immediately, claiming she had already filed emergency paperwork to secure the estate while I was at the office. My family had not just betrayed me, they had coordinated a surgical strike on my entire existence. I did not beg her to reconsider. I did not remind her of the 40 years I spent providing her with a life of absolute luxury. I walked past her, climbed the grand staircase, and entered my bedroom. I took a single leather duffel bag from this closet. I packed a few changes of clothes, my essential medications, and nothing else. I did not take the expensive watches she bought me or the tailored suits that represented the corporate world they had just stolen. I left the gold cufflinks and the luxury car keys on the dresser. I packed in complete, absolute silence. My stoicism was not a sign of surrender. It was a survival mechanism I had learned a lifetime ago. You see, I had no family history to fall back on, no childhood home to retreat to. 38 years ago, at the age of 32, I woke up in a state hospital, covered in bandages and hooked to machines. I had survived a catastrophic train derailment that claimed dozens of lives, but the physical trauma had completely erased my memory. I had severe amnesia. I did not know my real name, my parents, or where I came from. The state assigned me the name Joseph, and I built my entire existence from absolute zero. I worked night shifts at a loading dock, saved every single penny I earned, and eventually bought my first delivery truck. Every single thing I had lost today, I had built from the ashes of a destroyed past. I knew how to survive having nothing, because nothing was exactly where I began. I walked down the stairs, ignoring Brenda's triumphant sneer as she watched me leave. I stepped out into the freezing rain and drove my personal car until I reached the edge of the city, far away from the affluent neighborhoods and the corporate skyscrapers that now belonged to my traitorous son. I parked outside a rundown neon-lit diner. The rain hit the pavement in heavy sheets as I pushed open the glass door. The diner was nearly empty, smelling of stale coffee and fried food. I slid into a corner booth, ordering a black coffee. I sat there watching the rain streak the window, methodically processing the profound betrayal of my wife and children. I was entirely alone in the world, once again, a man without a past, and suddenly without a future. The rusty bell above the diner door chimed loudly. I did not look up from my coffee cup until a shadow fell over my table. A sharply dressed African-American man slid into the booth directly opposite me. He wore a pristine tailored suit that looked wildly out of place in this greasy spoon. He was incredibly old, easily in his 90s, but his posture was rigid, and his eyes were terrifyingly sharp. He did not ask if the seat was taken. He simply sat down and stared at me. He studied my face with an intense, calculated scrutiny that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He looked at the shape of my jaw, the set of my shoulders, and the deep lines around my eyes. I was about to ask him if he had a problem when he finally spoke. His voice was a low, commanding rumble that carried decades of authority and an undeniable weight. "You are the spitting image of my boy," he said. His unblinking gaze locked onto mine. But my boy vanished in a massive train wreck 38 years ago. My heart slammed against my ribs. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at this complete stranger, my mind racing through the impossible implications of his words. 38 years, the train derailment, my absolute loss of memory. Before I could form a single coherent sentence, the old man reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a faded, yellowing document enclosed in a plastic sleeve and slid it slowly across the sticky diner table. It was an adoption file dated 1956. "My name is William," the old man said, leaning forward so that only I could hear his next 5 words. "I am your biological father." I stared at the man sitting across from me. The flickering neon sign of the diner cast long shadows over the yellowing paper he had just slid across the table. I told him he had the wrong man. I survived a train derailment 38 years ago, and the state gave me a name because I had absolutely nothing else. I had no history, and I certainly had no bloodline. William did not blink. He reached into his tailored jacket again and produced a thick black leather folder. He placed it squarely on top of the adoption file. He told me he did not deal in sentimental guesswork. He dealt in absolute certainties. He opened the folder to reveal a heavily redacted federal biometric report. My fingerprints were on the first page alongside dental records from my time in the state hospital. Next to them were fresh DNA sequencing results from a private laboratory in Geneva. The match probability was 99.9%. I explained that his private intelligence firm had been tracking my movements for the past 11 months. They retrieved a discarded coffee cup from my executive suite to secure the genetic sample. I felt a cold shock of reality set in. This was not a grieving old man clinging to false hope. This was a man of immense, terrifying resources. William spoke with surgical precision. He explained that he built a global holdings empire from the ground up but his only heir was stolen during a chaotic hospital transfer following the 1986 rail disaster. He spent 3 decades and tens of millions of dollars penetrating sealed government archives to find me. He knew everything about my life. He knew I started by loading cargo pallets on the night shift. He knew I built a national logistics empire with my own bare hands. He looked at me with a fierce, uncompromising pride that I had never experienced from a father figure. He stated that I inherited his relentless drive to build and survive. But then his expression hardened into a mask of pure, calculated fury. He leaned closer and told me that his intelligence operatives had not just been investigating my genetics. They had been investigating my corporate boardroom. He knew exactly what my son and daughter-in-law had done to me this morning. I demanded to know what his operatives had found. William did not sugarcoat the betrayal. He laid out the exact financial mechanics of my execution. He revealed that Michael and his ambitious wife, Megan, did not organically persuade the minority shareholders to vote against me. They lacked the liquid capital for a legitimate buyout. Instead, Megan used her connections in the venture capital sector to secure a highly illegal, heavily leveraged bridge loan from a shadow syndicate. They used my own company assets as hidden collateral to fund the hostile takeover. William handed me a printed ledger detailing the offshore wire transfers. The numbers were irrefutable. Michael had literally mortgaged the future of the logistics firm I built to fund my immediate termination. They expected an upcoming tech merger to cover the syndicate debt before anyone noticed the fraudulent leveraging. I felt a deep, suffocating anger replace the shock of my eviction. I had spent my entire life teaching Michael the value of structural integrity and honest labor. In return, he had partnered with a ruthless opportunist to hollow out my legacy from the inside. William watched my face harden. He stated that my family viewed me as a disposable stepping stone. He offered me a choice. I could sit in this miserable diner and accept my forced retirement, or I could stand up, walk out that door with him, and systematically dismantle the false empire they built on my back. I looked at the DNA paper, the forged corporate ledgers, and then at the uncompromising eyes of the father I never knew I had. I did not need to think about it. I reached across the sticky table and firmly grasped his extended hand. It was an unspoken oath of absolute ruin for those who betrayed me. I slid out of the booth and followed William out of the diner. The freezing rain was still pouring down, but I no longer felt the cold. A sleek, armored black sedan waited at the curb, with a driver standing at attention. I climbed into the back seat, leaving the ruins of my former life on the wet pavement. The heavy armored doors of the sedan locked with a solid metallic thud, sealing us inside a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary. William poured 2 glasses of scotch from a hidden compartment. But before I could take a sip, my mobile phone vibrated violently against my chest. It was not a single notification. It was a rapid, relentless barrage of high-priority alerts from my primary banking institution. I pulled the device from my pocket and stared at the glowing screen. Every single one of my personal checking accounts showed a restricted status. My executive retirement fund, which held over $40 million in liquid capital, was completely locked. My secondary emergency accounts were entirely wiped from the user interface. I attempted to log into my private brokerage portal, but the screen flashed a red legal compliance warning. I was completely locked out of my entire net worth. William calmly placed his glass down and asked his driver to patch into the municipal court database. Within 60 seconds, the driver handed a tablet back to William. The old man scanned the legal filings and handed the tablet directly to me. Brenda and Megan had not wasted a single minute after kicking me out of the house. They had rushed directly to a district judge and filed an ex parte emergency financial injunction. The legal justification printed on the court order made my blood run ice cold. My wife of 40 years had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was experiencing a rapid, severe onset of dementia. Megan had submitted a fabricated affidavit claiming I had threatened to liquidate the corporate accounts and flee the country in a paranoid delusion. They had officially weaponized the legal system to paralyze me. By declaring me cognitively unfit and a massive flight risk, they successfully froze every dollar to my name. I could not hire a lawyer. I could not rent a hotel room. I could not even buy a meal. I was a multimillionaire stripped down to the clothes on my back. They planned to drain the corporate accounts completely, while I remained hopelessly trapped in the slow-moving gears of the probate courts. I looked at William, realizing the horrifying precision of their strike. The revelation that my life's work had been legally hijacked and placed into a holding company under Megan's maiden name was a masterclass in corporate theft. The proprietary shipping route patents were the absolute crown jewel of my empire. They were the highly complex algorithms that optimized national freight efficiency, the exact reason my company dominated the industry. Jonathan had the digital paper trail mapped out perfectly on the monitors of his secure offshore server room. Megan and my white son-in-law Connor had forged my signature with terrifying precision. They were actively preparing to sell my logistics algorithms to the highest bidder in the tech sector. Before Jonathan could pull the escrow details to see who they were negotiating with, my secure mobile vibrated. The caller ID showed the private clinic of my primary physician, a man who had managed my cardiovascular health for 20 years. I answered the call, expecting the usual confirmation for my comprehensive annual physical. Instead, the clinic administrator spoke with a sterile, rehearsed coldness. She informed me that all my upcoming appointments, including my vital neurological baseline exams and physical screenings, were permanently canceled. I demanded an immediate explanation. The administrator hesitated, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper, before admitting they had received a massive cease and desist order from my corporate legal team. Megan had submitted a thoroughly fabricated injunction to the clinic network. She cited her newly forged status as my medical proxy, doubling down on the lie that my dementia had reached a critical, irreversible stage. She legally barred the doctors from evaluating or treating me without her explicit written consent. The sheer malice of their strategy hit me like a physical blow. They were not just freezing my money. They were weaponizing the healthcare system against me. By legally blocking my access to independent medical professionals, my fabricated cognitive decline became the only official narrative on record. If I could not prove I was sane, I could not challenge the forged patent transfers in court. Megan was deliberately accelerating my death on paper. She needed me medically erased so she could finalize the multi-million-dollar tech buyout of my life's work without a single legal hurdle. I lowered the phone, the dial tone buzzing in the quiet room. I looked at Jonathan and my father, William. My own family had effectively placed a legal gag order on my brain. I relayed the clinic's message to Jonathan. He did not flinch or offer useless sympathy. He simply closed his laptop and stated that local medical networks were easily intimidated by aggressive corporate litigators. We needed a diagnostic authority that Megan's legal threats could not possibly penetrate. William stepped forward, his eyes burning with that same relentless intensity I had first seen in the diner. He pulled out his and made a single brief call. 3 hours later, I was walking through the heavily fortified doors of an independent federal medical examination facility. It was a highly secure testing center typically reserved for clearing commercial aviation pilots and federal intelligence operatives. Because William's shadow empire held massive government contracts, he had bypassed the standard waiting lists entirely. I was ushered into a sterile, brightly lit examination room where a panel of 3 independent, board-certified neurologists and forensic psychiatrists awaited me. For the next 5 hours, they put me through a grueling gauntlet of cognitive stress tests. I underwent comprehensive brain scans to map my neurological pathways. I solved complex spatial logic puzzles, executed rapid memory recall sequences, and navigated dense psychological evaluations designed to detect even the absolute slightest hint of mental deterioration. I drew upon the exact same raw, analytical focus I had used to build my logistics empire from a single delivery truck. I did not falter once. When the rigorous testing finally concluded, the lead examiner walked into the room holding a thick stamped dossier. He looked at me with profound professional respect. He handed me a certified, notarized medical affidavit bearing federal seals. The results were irrefutable. The panel concluded that my cognitive function was completely flawless, operating with the sharpness and clarity of a man 20 years my junior. Megan's fraudulent medical proxy was now entirely worthless. I held the physical proof of my sanity in my hands. It was a ticking time bomb legally primed to utterly destroy the false narrative my treacherous family had built. We returned to Jonathan's secure office with the federal affidavit secured in my briefcase. We finally had the ammunition to shatter their injunction, but the war was escalating much faster than we anticipated. As soon as we walked through the door, the massive financial news monitors mounted on Jonathan's wall flared to life with a breaking industry alert. My son Michael was holding a live press conference from the grand lobby of my former corporate headquarters. He stood at a podium flanked by Megan and Connor. He looked directly into the cameras and put on a masterful, disgusting performance. His voice cracked with perfectly manufactured sorrow as he announced to the world that his father had tragically lost his battle with severe dementia. He claimed my sudden departure from the company was a heartbreaking necessity for my own safety and the survival of the business. But the fabricated grief was merely a preamble to his real agenda. Michael confidently adjusted his tailored suit and announced a lavish, highly exclusive media gala set to take place this coming Saturday night at the city's most prestigious ballroom. The purpose of the gala was a complete corporate rebranding. He was officially erasing my name and my legacy from the logistics industry, forever restructuring the entire empire under a new banner headed by his wife, Megan. The final knife twist came when Michael proudly teased the attendance of several massive international venture capitalists at the event. He promised the elite crowd the unveiling of a revolutionary logistical software integration. My blood ran cold. He was not just throwing a party to celebrate my downfall. He was using the high-profile gala as an elite auction house to sell my stolen routing patents to the highest bidder in front of the global press. If Megan and Connor closed that sale on Saturday night, the proprietary algorithms I had bled for would be absorbed by an international conglomerate, lost in a maze of corporate red tape forever. I watched my son smile for the flashing cameras, absolutely certain he had won. I turned to Jonathan and told him to secure me a bespoke suit. I was going to crash my own funeral. The grand ballroom of the City Plaza Hotel was drowning in the blinding light of camera flashes and the arrogant hum of inherited wealth. I stepped out of Jonathan's armored sedan into the freezing night air, adjusting the cuffs of the flawless charcoal bespoke suit he had procured for me within hours. It was the exact shade and cut I used to wear when negotiating international shipping contracts. I walked through the towering glass doors of the venue, completely ignoring the valet and the front desk staff. My posture was rigid, my steps deliberate and unyielding. I possessed the silent, heavy authority of a man who had spent 38 years surviving loading docks, union disputes, and ruthless corporate warfare after waking up in a hospital with absolutely no past. I slipped into the back of the crowded ballroom, just as my son Michael took the center stage. The room was packed with the most aggressive venture capitalists in the tech sector. Michael stood behind a crystal podium flanked by massive digital banners, projecting the new sanitized logo of my logistics empire under Megan's corporate umbrella. Megan stood respectfully a few feet behind him, wearing a designer evening gown and a perfectly manufactured expression of profound sorrow. I watched from the shadows as Michael leaned into the microphone. He lowered his voice, painting a tragic, disgusting picture of my existence. He told the silent, captivated room that his father had tragically succumbed to aggressive, rapid-onset dementia. He claimed my mind was completely gone, reducing the titan who built the national freight infrastructure into a paranoid shell of a man who had to be forcibly removed for his own safety. He spun this absolute lie to solicit millions in new funding, framing his hostile Yale takeover as a heroic rescue mission. He promised the elite investors in the room that by the end of the night, they would have exclusive purchasing rights to the proprietary routing patents I had spent 2 decades developing. He was selling my life's work to the highest bidder on a stage built entirely from deceit. I did not shout. I did not interrupt his pathetic speech. I simply waited until the applause died down and the networking session began. The waitstaff began circulating with trays of champagne. Michael and Megan immediately descended from the stage to swarm the lead investor, a notorious European tech venture capitalist, whose massive capital injection was required to legitimize their fraudulent rebrand. I watched them herd him toward a towering champagne fountain near the grand windows. I did not approach my family. I did not give them the satisfaction of a confrontation. I walked with absolute precision, slicing through the crowd of elite socialites until I was standing directly beside the European investor. I waited for Michael to turn his head to grab a drink before I moved. I stepped directly in front of the investor, blocking his view of my treacherous daughter-in-law. I introduced myself with a quiet, icy calm. I handed him a heavy black leather folder containing the certified documents Jonathan had pulled from our offshore shadow trust. I told the investor to read the first page before he wired $1 into Megan's holding company. He opened the folder, his brow furrowing in confusion. Inside, he found the notarized federal medical affidavit proving my cognitive function was completely flawless, legally shattering Michael's entire tragic narrative. But the second document was the lethal blow. It was the certified corporate deed proving that the core routing algorithms and national shipping patents were no longer tethered to the logistics firm. These algorithms took me 20 years to map out, tracking every truck, train, and cargo ship across the continent. They were the central nervous system of my life's work. I explained in a low, unwavering voice that Megan and my white son-in-law Connor had forged my physical signature to transfer those patents. I informed the investor that my new offshore trust now legally owned every single line of code they were attempting to sell him tonight. I looked the man dead in the eye and stated that my son was selling him stolen air, and if he signed that contract, my legal team would drag his international firm into a decade-long federal racketeering investigation. The investor's face drained of all color. He was a ruthless businessman, but he was not a fool. He recognized a catastrophic legal liability the exact second it was placed in his hands. He slammed the leather folder shut and shoved it directly into Michael's chest. Michael stumbled backward, his champagne glass shattering on the marble floor. The investor did not ask for an explanation or wait for an apology. He signaled his security detail and loudly announced to the surrounding executives that his firm was pulling their capital effective immediately. The absolute panic that washed over Michael's face was a masterpiece of instant karma. He looked at the folder, then looked up and finally saw me standing there, perfectly composed and terrifyingly sane. Megan realized her grand corporate launch was imploding in real time. The elite investors were murmuring, stepping back, sensing the toxic legal exposure radiating from the stage. She saw me standing by the champagne tower and knew her entire fraudulent empire was disintegrating. But Megan was a vicious, cornered animal, and cornered animals do not surrender. They attack. Instead of trying to argue the legal facts, she weaponized the cameras. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that silenced the entire ballroom. She charged directly at me, violently tearing the shoulder strap of her own designer gown as she ran. She threw herself purposefully against a cocktail table, sending glass and metal crashing to the floor. She scrambled backward on the marble, pointing a trembling finger at me while sobbing uncontrollably. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I had completely lost my mind, that I had broken through the security perimeter, and that I had just physically assaulted her. She knew that a public display of violence from a supposedly senile, unhinged old man would immediately trigger an emergency psychiatric hold. The flashing lights of 50 media cameras immediately swiveled in our direction, capturing the exact narrative she needed. She was using my fabricated dementia to frame me for a violent crime on live television, ensuring the police would lock me away before the night was over. The ballroom descends into absolute chaos. The very second, Megan tears her designer gown and throws herself against the cocktail table. Security guards swarm the area, grabbing my arms with aggressive force. I do not resist their grip. I know perfectly well that struggling would only feed their fabricated narrative of a dementia-induced violent outburst. Two uniformed city police officers push through the panicked crowd of elite investors within a single minute. Connor is right beside them, acting the part of the protective, terrified son-in-law. He points directly at me, telling the officers that I am suffering from severe cognitive decline and that I just brutally attacked his wife without any provocation. Megan remains on the marble floor, sobbing hysterically into her ruined dress, clutching her shoulder as if she has been severely wounded. The media cameras never stop flashing, capturing every agonizing angle. I am shoved against the ornate ballroom wall, and the cold steel of handcuffs bites sharply into my wrists. I look over at my son Michael, who is standing completely still near the shattered champagne fountain. He is watching his own father being publicly humiliated, stripped of his dignity in front of the exact financial elite I spent 40 years doing business with. I do not show an ounce of fear or betrayal. I tell the arresting officers I am fully cooperating with their orders. They march me out through the grand lobby under the blinding glare of the paparazzi. It is a highly coordinated surgical media execution. Megan and Michael want the image of the great logistics titan being dragged out like a rabid animal plastered on the front page of every financial publication in the country by morning. By the time they push me into the cramped back of the squad car, I know exactly what their endgame really is. A violent public arrest gives their legal team the perfect ammunition to force an involuntary psychiatric hold on my medical record. If they lock me in a state medical ward for a mandatory 72-hour observation period, they will have exactly enough time to bypass my offshore trust and finalize the sale of my routing algorithms. The heavy doors of the police cruiser slam shut. I sit in the darkness as the siren wails perfectly calm. They think they have permanently cornered me, but they have absolutely no idea I have the full weight of a stealth billionaire backing my every single move. I am placed in a sterile, windowless interrogation room at the downtown police precinct. A hardened detective walks in carrying a thick legal file, explaining that my family is pressing felony assault charges and requesting an immediate medical transfer to a state psychiatric facility. Before I can even formulate a response, the heavy metal door swings open with tremendous force. Jonathan steps into the room. He does not ask for permission to enter or excuse his sudden presence. He carries the absolute, terrifying authority of a man backed by limitless capital and top-tier legal influence. He slams a sleek silver laptop onto the metal interrogation table and tells the detective that this interview is officially over. He states with icy precision that the assault charges are entirely fabricated and that he possesses irrefutable evidence proving my daughter-in-law just committed a massive felony by filing a false police report. Jonathan opens the laptop and plays a high-definition time-stamped security video. The footage is crystal clear. It shows me sitting in that neon-lit diner on the edge of the city drinking black coffee with William. The time matches the exact hour. Megan claimed in her police statement that I had breached her private residence to threaten her life before stalking her to the corporate gala. William had secured the diner footage the exact moment we formed our alliance, anticipating their every desperate legal maneuver. The detective watches the video closely, his expression hardening as he realizes his department has been used as a pawn in a vicious corporate boardroom coup. Jonathan hands the detective a certified copy of my federal medical evaluation, thoroughly destroying the false dementia narrative Megan built her case upon. He demands my immediate release and formally requests that the police department flag Megan for malicious prosecution. The detective unlocks my handcuffs without a single word of protest. The elaborate trap Megan and Connor set for me has shattered completely. I rub my wrists, feeling the blood flow return to my hands. I walk out of the precinct, a completely free man, leaving a massive, highly illegal liability sitting squarely on my daughter-in-law's shoulders. I step out into the freezing night air, where William's armored sedan is already waiting at the curb. Jonathan holds the heavy door for me, completely unfazed by the legal chaos we just systematically dismantled. I slide into the leather seat, but before the driver can even merge into the city traffic, a secure mobile phone Jonathan handed me earlier begins to vibrate aggressively. The caller ID is completely blocked, but I recognize the specific number pattern. I answer the call. "It is my wife of 40 years, Brenda." Her voice comes through the speaker, shaking with wild manufactured desperation. She is sobbing heavily, gasping for air, as if her entire world is collapsing around her. She begs me not to hang up the phone. She claims that she made a catastrophic mistake by siding with Michael and Megan during the hostile takeover. She cries that Michael's greed is spiraling violently out of control and that he is tearing our entire family apart for the sake of corporate power. She tells me she is terrified of her own son and fears for her personal safety. She pleads for a private meeting at the old municipal park down by the river, insisting we need to speak face-to-face to stop this brutal feud before it destroys our children completely. I listen to her hyperventilating, mapping every subtle inflection of her voice. After 40 years of marriage, I know every single one of her tells. The panic is entirely fabricated. She is not calling to apologize or to save our fractured family. She is executing a highly coordinated contingency plan because they just received word from the precinct that my arrest completely fell apart. She wants to lure me into a neutral, uncontrolled environment under the guise of an emotional surrender. I tell her with a perfectly flat tone that I will meet her at the park in exactly 1 hour. I hang up the phone and look out the tinted window of the sedan as the city lights blur past. My treacherous wife thinks she is setting a brilliant trap for a heartbroken, vulnerable old man. She is about to find out exactly what happens when you try to bait a predator who already knows your every move. I arrived at the municipal park exactly 1 hour later. The freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, dense fog rolling off the dark river. Jonathan had meticulously positioned 2 of William's private security operatives in the distant tree line to monitor the perimeter, but I walked down the paved concrete path entirely alone. Brenda was sitting on a cold iron bench under the dim, flickering glow of a single streetlight. She wore a heavy cashmere coat and held a designer handbag tightly in her lap. When she saw me approach through the fog, she immediately launched into her highly rehearsed performance. Tears spilled down her cheeks with perfect theatrical timing. She stood up quickly, reaching a hand out, as if she wanted to embrace me, but I stopped her dead in her tracks with a single uncompromising look. She collapsed back onto the bench and began to sob heavily into her hands. She told me the last few days had been an absolute living nightmare for her. She claimed Michael had become an unrecognizable monster, consumed by his own corporate greed, and that his new wife, Megan, was a ruthless manipulator tearing the fabric of our family to shreds. Brenda begged me to end the brutal war right here and now. She reached into her expensive coat pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. She called it a modest settlement, a simple compromise that would guarantee me a comfortable retirement, while quietly relinquishing the routing patents back to the main corporation. She swore that if I just signed the paper tonight, the false medical injunctions would disappear, the hostility would end, and we could somehow salvage whatever was left of our family legacy. She leaned forward, using the exact same trembling, desperate voice she had used on the secure phone call. She reminded me of the 40 years we spent together, the extreme struggles we overcame when I first built the logistics company with my bare hands and the sacred vows we made to protect each other. It was a masterful, sickening display of emotional manipulation, specifically designed to break the resolve of a tired, heartbroken husband. But I was not a heartbroken husband anymore. I was a man operating with lethal focus. I kept my hands firmly in my pockets and stared down at the woman who had handed me divorce papers and demanded my eviction without a second thought just days ago. I did not even glance at the settlement papers she held in her trembling hands. My eyes were fixed entirely on the slight opening of her designer handbag resting on the bench beside her. Hidden just beneath the leather clasp was the faint rhythmic pulse of a tiny red light. She was wearing a digital wire. This entire desperate meeting was a highly calculated legal ambush. She needed me to lose my temper to threaten her physically, or to accidentally admit to hiding assets offshore. She wanted to capture an angry, erratic rant on audio to submit to the district judge as definitive proof of my fabricated dementia and dangerous paranoia. I did not give her the satisfaction of anger. I spoke with a chilling, perfectly calibrated calm, making absolutely sure my voice carried clearly and evenly into her hidden microphone. I told her I would not sign the settlement under any circumstances. I then proceeded to surgically dismantle her entire defense on the official record. I stated her full legal name clearly and listed the exact dates and times she had secretly diverted funds from our joint personal accounts. I recited the specific routing numbers of the offshore shell companies she had established months before Michael launched the hostile takeover. I detailed a massive transaction from last October where she illegally wired $2 million of my personal capital to a private holding account without my knowledge or consent. I kept my voice perfectly flat and unwavering, ensuring the digital recording captured the absolute lucidity of my mind and the undeniable facts of her financial crimes. I told her that she was currently holding a forged legal document attempting to extort me for stolen corporate patents. I made it abundantly clear that every single word I was saying was backed by certified banking receipts compiled by federal auditors and my new wealth manager. The color completely drained from Brenda's face. She looked down at her handbag and realized her brilliant trap had just snapped shut violently on her own neck. Instead of baiting me into a paranoid outburst, she had just successfully recorded a flawless, highly detailed confession of her own massive felony fraud. Her hands began to shake, but this time the tremor was absolutely genuine. The fabricated tears stopped instantly. The loving, desperate wife vanished completely, replaced by a terrified woman realizing she was legally cornered. Brenda scrambled to reach into her handbag and hastily shut off the recording device, but the damage was already permanently sealed. She dropped the useless settlement papers onto the wet pavement at my feet. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. She looked frantically around the empty park, the brutal reality of her impending federal prosecution finally taking hold. But the profound fear in her eyes was not just about going to prison. There was a raw, primal panic that went far deeper than corporate fraud. She lunged forward and grabbed the lapels of my coat, screaming that I did not understand the gravity of the situation. She abandoned the entire lie about Michael's greed and shrieked the actual terrifying truth. She yelled that I had to sign over the patents immediately because our daughter Alyssa and my white son-in-law Connor were completely out of time. Brenda confessed that Alyssa and Connor had secretly leveraged their stolen shares in the logistics company to secure a massive, highly illegal loan from a violent offshore syndicate. They used the dark money to fund their lavish lifestyle, assuming the routing patents would sell for billions at the gala and easily cover the debt. But when I ruined the tech buyout and publicly proved the patents were gone, the logistics company's stock value plummeted overnight. The syndicate's collateral evaporated in an instant, and the ruthless lenders were now violently calling in the debt. Brenda sobbed hysterically, screaming that the syndicate had already sent armed collectors to Connor's downtown office yesterday afternoon. The entire family was secretly drowning in toxic lethal liabilities, and my stolen patents were their only remaining lifeline. If I did not surrender the offshore trust right now, the syndicate was going to violently dismantle our daughter's life. I looked down at the woman who had tried to legally erase my existence. She was begging me to save the very people who had orchestrated my complete ruin. I did not offer her a single shred of comfort. I simply pulled her hands off my coat, turned my back on her, and walked away into the fog, leaving her screaming my name in the dark. I climbed back into the armored sedan where Jonathan was waiting. I told him to find out exactly who owned my daughter's debt. The board was set, and I was about to buy the final pieces. Jonathan opened his encrypted laptop before the armored sedan even merged onto the highway. He did not need days to track down the financial predators terrorizing my daughter and my son-in-law. He needed exactly 14 minutes. The glowing screen illuminated the dark cabin of the vehicle as Jonathan bypassed 3 layers of international banking firewalls. He pulled up the highly classified ledger of a ruthless offshore syndicate operating out of the Cayman Islands. He turned the screen toward me and laid out the exact anatomy of Connor and Alyssa's toxic greed. When Michael first initiated the hostile boardroom coup, he promised them a massive immediate payout from the sale of my routing algorithms. But Connor was impatient. He possessed the reckless, unearned arrogance of a man who had never actually built anything. He and Alyssa wanted their luxury instantly. They used their newly acquired, unvested corporate shares as direct collateral to secure a high-interest short-term bridge loan from the syndicate. They borrowed $8 million in dark money to fund an aggressive real estate portfolio and a lavish lifestyle, entirely confident that the tech buyout at the gala would easily cover the principal. But my quiet intervention at the Champagne Tower had completely shattered their timeline. When I publicly proved the proprietary patents were legally untouchable, the logistics company lost its primary valuation overnight. The stock plummeted the second the markets opened. The syndicate immediately realized their collateral was absolutely worthless. Criminal financial organizations do not issue polite margin calls or send legal cease and desist letters. They send heavily armed collectors. Jonathan pulled up a time-stamped security image from the lobby of Connor's private downtown office building. The photograph showed 2 massive, unidentified men in dark suits forcefully escorting Connor into a private elevator yesterday afternoon. The syndicate had given him a strict, non-negotiable deadline. He had until midnight tonight to produce the $8 million in liquid cash, or they would begin systematically dismantling his life, starting with his physical safety. Brenda was not lying about the danger. My family was actively bleeding out in a shark tank of their own creation. I looked at the security image of Connor sweating in the elevator. I felt absolutely no pity for the man who had conspired to forge my signature and lock me in a psychiatric ward. William poured himself a single measure of bourbon from the sedan's hidden console. He looked at me with the cold, calculating precision. He stated that we were not going to let a foreign syndicate dictate the terms of our family's destruction. He picked up his secure mobile phone and dialed a private wealth director in Geneva. William did not ask for favors. He issued a unilateral corporate command. He instructed his team to immediately contact the Cayman Syndicate through a heavily fortified shell company. Criminal lenders care about exactly one thing, which is instant liquidity. William offered to purchase Connor and Alyssa's entire debt portfolio, outright paying the principal balance, plus a massive premium in untraceable digital assets. The transaction took less than 20 minutes to clear the international dark markets. The syndicate eagerly took the guaranteed payout and completely relinquished their claim. Jonathan's portable printer hummed quietly in the back of the sedan. He handed me a stack of warm, freshly printed legal documents. They were the original promissory notes bearing the digital signatures of my daughter and her treacherous husband. William had legally transferred the entire debt portfolio into my offshore trust. The syndicate was officially out of the picture. I was now the undisputed sole owner of my daughter's massive financial liabilities. I held the exact paperwork required to bankrupt them, foreclose on their properties, and legally seize every single asset to their name. They owed me $8 million, and the debt was still due by midnight. I looked down at the signatures on the paper, feeling a profound shift in the balance of power. They had tried to strip me of my legacy, and in doing so, they had accidentally handed me the absolute legal right to destroy theirs. I folded the documents and placed them inside my jacket pocket. I told Jonathan to monitor their domestic accounts. Connor was terrified, and completely unaware that the debt had changed hands. He still believed violent enforcers were coming for him at midnight. He was going to make a desperate, catastrophic mistake to find that money, and I wanted a front-row seat when he did. Jonathan routed his monitors to mirror the municipal property transfer database. We arrived at my secure corporate office just as the alert flashed across his screen. Connor was panicking. He needed $8 million in liquid cash before the midnight deadline, and he only had one asset large enough to cover the spread. He was attempting to execute a rapid under-the-table sale of the family's historic waterfront estate. It was a sprawling, $10 million property I had purchased 2 decades ago. Connor had contacted a shady real estate broker and miraculously found an anonymous cash buyer willing to close the transaction on the exact same day. He eagerly submitted the forged power of attorney to the title company, attempting to bypass the standard legal waiting periods and force the escrow account to release the funds immediately. He thought he had found a miraculous loophole to save his own skin. I was completely wrong. Jonathan smiled coldly at the glowing monitor. He pointed to a flashing red error code on the title transfer request. 10 years ago, when I first purchased the waterfront estate, I anticipated that standard legal documents could easily be compromised by ambitious executives or greedy relatives. I had quietly implemented a state-level biometric lock on the property deed. A forged signature and a fraudulent power of attorney were entirely useless. The municipal escrow system was hard-coded to reject any transfer of ownership without my direct physical thumbprint scanned into a certified federal terminal. Connor's expedited sale hit a massive, impenetrable brick wall. Jonathan hacked into this broker's digital communication log and pulled up the real-time messages. Connor was losing his mind. The broker was demanding the biometric clearance to release the $8 million in cash, and Connor had absolutely no way to provide it. I was trapped. He could not sell the estate, he could not pay the debt, and the midnight deadline was rapidly approaching. I stood in my quiet office watching the digital logs update with his terrified messages. Connor was going to have to find a way to illegally bypass a federal biometric security system before midnight, sealing his fate as a desperate, cornered felon. Jonathan tapped a series of complex commands into his encrypted console, bringing up a live high-definition audio and visual feed directly from Connor's downtown corporate office. The room on the screen was thick with absolute panic. Connor was pacing the floor, frantically pulling at his expensive tie and screaming at Michael through the speakerphone. The biometric lock I had placed on my waterfront estate years ago had completely derailed their rapid timeline. Michael arrived at the office 20 minutes later, his usual arrogant composure entirely shattered. He realized immediately that if Connor defaulted on the massive syndicate debt, the violent offshore collectors would not just stop at Connor. They would trace the stolen corporate shares directly back to Michael and Megan. They were all heavily exposed to a very real, very physical threat. I watched through the compromised security camera as Michael paced the room, weighing his rapidly shrinking options. He picked up his mobile phone and dialed a burner number he clearly reserved for absolute emergencies. He contacted a disgraced former municipal clerk who still maintained illegal backdoor administrative credentials to the county deed registry. Michael offered the corrupt official a staggering $500,000 bribe to log into the federal terminal and manually override my biometric requirement. He instructed the man to input a fabricated system error code, claiming the fingerprint scanner at the title company had malfunctioned and that verbal authorization had been granted by a presiding judge. It was a brazen, highly illegal maneuver that carried a mandatory federal prison sentence if discovered. But Michael and Connor were not thinking about federal prison right now. They were thinking about the armed enforcers who were scheduled to break their legs at midnight. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching my own son willingly cross the line into major felony fraud. He was no longer just an ambitious executive trying to push his aging father out of a company. He was a desperate, sweating criminal manufacturing digital keys to steal a $10 million property. The corrupt notary accepted the massive bribe without a single moment of hesitation. He promised to have the biometric override completed and the deed officially transferred to the anonymous cash buyer within the hour. The digital clock on Jonathan's monitor ticked relentlessly closer to midnight. The trap was perfectly set, and my son was actively loading the gun that would permanently destroy him. The atmosphere in Jonathan's secure offshore office was heavy with anticipation. The only illumination came from the massive wall of monitors tracking the illegal transaction in real time. We had direct undetected access to the county registry database, and we watched the corrupt notary log into the system using his illicit administrative credentials. A bright red warning box flashed across Jonathan's primary screen, indicating that the biometric override protocol had been initiated at the municipal level. Jonathan turned to me with his hands hovering precisely over his keyboard. He stated that he could easily block the override command, lock the notary out of the terminal, and terminate the property sale immediately. He waited for my final command. I looked at the live feed of Michael and Connor pacing their office, staring at their own computer screens in a terrified, breathless sweat. I told Jonathan to stand down and let the illegal transaction proceed completely uninterrupted. If we blocked the sale now, they would simply look for another desperate avenue to escape their debt. I needed them to fully commit to the federal crime. I needed the digital ink to dry on the forged transfer documents so there could be absolutely no deniability in a court of law. Jonathan nodded and removed his hands from the keyboard. We sat in profound silence and watched the progress bar on the county registry inch forward pixel by pixel. The psychological weight of the moment pressed heavily down on my chest. I was consciously allowing my son to finalize a grand larceny scheme that would inevitably end his life as a free man. But I felt absolutely no regret or sorrow. Michael had made his choice the morning he sat in my boardroom and declared my mind was rotting to the shareholders. He had made his choice when he helped freeze my legitimate bank accounts and tried to leave me destitute on the freezing streets. The progress bar reached 100%. The biometric lock was successfully bypassed through the fraudulent administrative override. The deed to my historic waterfront estate was officially transferred out of my name. The escrow company received the automated green light, indicating the title was entirely clear. The final barrier was removed. The $8 million wire transfer from the anonymous cash buyer was officially released into the global banking network. The massive digital wire transfer hit Michael and Connor's joint corporate account at exactly 11:14 at night. Jonathan's monitor flared bright green, confirming the $8 million deposit had successfully settled and cleared. Through the audio feed, I heard Connor let out a loud, hysterical gasp of pure relief. Michael slapped his hands on the heavy desk, shouting that they had actually pulled it off against all odds. They believed they had the liquid cash to pay off the violent offshore syndicate with 46 minutes to spare. They thought they had outsmarted the legal system and secured their survival through sheer ruthless ambition. Their celebration lasted for exactly 3 seconds. The green confirmation screen on Jonathan's monitor abruptly shifted to a glaring, flashing crimson red. The exact second the $8 million landed in their account, the central bank's automated fraud department triggered a catastrophic freeze protocol. Jonathan had spent the entire afternoon quietly laying the flawless groundwork for this exact moment. He had preemptively flagged the receiving account with the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, citing highly suspicious international wire activity and suspected money laundering. The bank's algorithms immediately locked the entire balance down to the very last cent. The funds were visible on their screen, but they were completely untouchable. Connor screamed in sheer, unfiltered panic, clicking his mouse furiously as red error codes flooded his banking portal. Michael grabbed the phone to call the bank executive line, but all he received was an automated message stating the account was under active federal investigation. Then Jonathan turned to me and revealed the final devastating layer of the trap we had set. I explained that the shady real estate broker had not found a random anonymous cash buyer. The entity that had just purchased my waterfront estate for $10 million was a fortified holding company, completely owned and operated by William. My biological father had used his own vast clean wealth to fund the illegal purchase. We had essentially bought my own house using William's capital to bait the trap. Michael and Connor had just committed massive federal wire fraud to steal money directly from a stealth billionaire. The clock struck midnight. The syndicate debt was officially due, the violent collectors were actively mobilizing, and my treacherous family was completely locked out of every single financial institution on the planet. I watched the financial apocalypse unfold from the pristine monitors in Jonathan's secure office as the sun rose over the city. The federal freeze had not just paralyzed Michael and Connor's personal assets. Because my treacherous family had recklessly intertwined the stolen corporate routing patents and the hijacked company shares with their fraudulent wire transfer, the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had thrown a massive blanket lockdown over the entire logistics empire. They were completely locked out of the corporate operating accounts. A national freight company requires millions in daily liquid capital to keep the trucks moving, to pay for diesel at weigh stations, and to process daily driver wages. At exactly 8 in the morning, the automated corporate payroll system attempted to process the weekly direct deposits for over 10,000 employees. The system bounced every single transaction. Jonathan intercepted the internal company communications and routed the audio feeds directly into my office. The panic inside Michael's executive suite was absolute and beautiful to witness. Regional directors were calling in from across the country, screaming, because driver fuel cards were declining at the pumps, leaving massive cargo shipments stranded on the highways. Union representatives were threatening immediate legal action over the unpaid wages. Megan was shrieking at the corporate accountants, demanding they open emergency lines of credit, but no bank on earth would extend a single dollar to a company actively under federal investigation for money laundering. Michael was completely paralyzed. He had spent his entire life wearing expensive tailored suits and pretending to understand the brutal logistics industry. But he had never actually managed a genuine operational crisis. Without my proprietary algorithms, without access to the company capital, he was just a terrified boy playing chief executive. The empire he stole from me was actively bleeding out on the boardroom floor. I knew that a logistics company is absolutely nothing without the men and women who actually control the asphalt. I did not wait for my son to try and pacify the angry workforce with empty corporate promises. I instructed Jonathan to rent the grand dining room of the most exclusive steakhouse in the financial district. I personally invited the top 50 regional fleet managers from my former company to a private, immediate dinner that very evening. These were the seasoned, hardened veterans I had personally trained over the past 3 decades. They were the generals who controlled the cross-country shipping lanes. They arrived at the restaurant, frustrated, confused, and demanding answers about their bounced paychecks. I walked into the dining room, and the entire chaotic space fell completely silent. They had all read Michael's pathetic press release claiming I was locked away in a dementia ward, incapable of forming a coherent sentence. Seeing me standing there, in a flawless, bespoke suit with absolute terrifying clarity, shattered my son's lies instantly. I did not waste their time with corporate buzzwords or false optimism. I told them the absolute truth. I explained that this company was functionally bankrupt due to massive executive fraud and that their unpaid wages were just the beginning of the inevitable collapse. Then I presented my counterattack. I announced the formation of a brand new logistics syndicate, fully backed by the limitless clean capital of my biological father, William. I slid a legally binding contract across the long mahogany table to every single manager in the room. I offered to cover all of their lost wages immediately in cash and double their current executive salaries if they walked out of Michael's company tonight and brought their absolute best drivers with them. The deep loyalty I had cultivated over 38 years paid off in exactly 10 minutes. Every single fleet manager signed the contract without hesitation. We orchestrated the largest mass corporate walkout in the history of the shipping industry before the dessert was even served. The devastating news of the mass corporate exodus hit Michael and Megan early the next morning. Without the fleet managers and the core routing algorithms, their stolen company was nothing but a useless collection of empty trucks and frozen bank accounts. I was sitting in my newly acquired executive office on the top floor of Williams' towering glass skyscraper when the ground floor security alarms began to blare. Jonathan quickly brought up the lobby surveillance feed on my main desktop monitor. Megan had completely abandoned her carefully manufactured facade of the elegant, concerned daughter-in-law. She had physically breached the heavy front doors of my new corporate headquarters. She looked entirely unhinged. Her designer hair was a tangled mess. Her expensive coat was thrown hastily over her shoulders, and her eyes were wild with sheer, unfiltered desperation. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding the fleet drivers return to her failing firm immediately. She hurled vicious abuses at the reception staff, loudly claiming I was a criminal who had stolen her rightful property and ruined her multi-million-dollar tech buyout. When a seasoned security guard stepped forward to block her path to the private executive elevators, Megan completely lost whatever fragile grip she had left on reality. She raised her hand and violently slapped the guard across the face, the sharp sound echoing through the cavernous marble lobby. She shoved past him, screaming my name and threatening to permanently destroy my life if I did not call the federal authorities and reverse the bank freeze immediately. I watched the violent, pathetic meltdown from my desk with absolute chilling satisfaction. I did not call down to the lobby to intervene or try to calm her down. I simply pressed a button on my intercom and instructed Jonathan to ensure every single high-definition security camera in the building was actively recording her felony assault from multiple angles. Megan had walked directly into my fortress and willingly handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to put her behind bars. The morning sun cast long shadows across my new executive office as the ground floor security alarms suddenly shattered the quiet hum of the skyscraper. Jonathan did not flinch. He simply tapped a key on his console, bringing the high-definition lobby surveillance feed directly onto my primary desktop monitor. Megan had completely abandoned her carefully manufactured facade of the elegant and untouchable corporate executive. She pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of our headquarters, looking entirely unhinged. Her expensive designer coat was thrown carelessly over her shoulders. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess clinging to her sweaty forehead, and her eyes were wide with sheer, unfiltered desperation. She marched directly into the cavernous marble lobby, screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded that my newly acquired fleet drivers return to her failing firm immediately. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the terrified reception staff, hurling vicious abuses and loudly claiming I was a criminal who had stolen her rightful property. She shrieked that I had maliciously ruined her multi-million-dollar tech buyout and destroyed her life. The sheer entitlement radiating from her was sickening. She truly believed that she could simply march into the fortress I had built with my biological father and demand the return of an empire she had stolen from me. A seasoned security guard stepped forward to de-escalate the situation. He placed himself firmly between Megan and the private executive elevators, instructing her to leave the premises immediately. Megan completely lost whatever fragile grip she had left on reality. She raised her hand and violently slapped the guard across the face. The sharp sound of the impact echoed clearly through the audio feed in my office. She tried to shove past him, screaming my name and threatening to permanently destroy me if I did not call the federal authorities to reverse the bank freeze. I watched her violent, pathetic meltdown from my desk with absolute chilling satisfaction. I did not call down to the lobby to intervene. I did not try to calm her down. I simply instructed Jonathan to ensure every single camera in the building was actively recording her felony assault from multiple angles. Megan had walked directly into my territory and willingly handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to put her behind bars. The security team did not hesitate after the physical strike. 2 additional guards immediately flanked her, restraining her arms, while she kicked and thrashed against the polished marble floor. It was during this violent struggle that her oversized designer handbag tipped over, spilling its contents across the lobby. Alongside her expensive cosmetics and car keys, 3 heavy encrypted hard drives clattered onto the stone tiles. Jonathan immediately recognized the silver casings. Before storming the main lobby, Megan had managed to slip into an unsecured ground-floor logistics annex down the street, pulling the backup routing algorithms from a secondary server terminal. She had physically stolen proprietary company hardware in a desperate attempt to salvage her ruined tech buyout. The wail of approaching police sirens cut through her hysterical screaming. 2 city patrol cars skidded to a halt outside the glass doors, and 4 uniformed officers rushed into the building. The moment Megan saw the police, she instantly tried to play the victim. She began sobbing, hysterically claiming the security guards had attacked her without provocation, and that she was merely a concerned daughter-in-law trying to check on my mental health. Her performance was a desperate, pathetic lie. The lead officer took one look at the bright red welt forming on the security guard's face and requested the surveillance footage. Jonathan transmitted the high-definition video files directly to the officer's secure tablet in real time. The police watched my daughter-in-law commit a blatant, unprovoked physical assault. They then looked down at the stolen encrypted hard drives scattered across the floor. The lead officer read her rights. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the lobby was the sweetest sound I had heard in 38 years. Megan screamed for Michael as the officers dragged her out of the building. She was officially arrested for felony assault, trespassing, and corporate espionage. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching the police cruiser drive away. The ambitious, ruthless woman who had forged my signature to steal my life's work was now sitting in the back of a squad car, facing a decade in federal prison. I turned to Jonathan and nodded slowly. The first pillar of their fraudulent empire had just collapsed completely under the weight of its own staggering arrogance. We did not have to lift a single finger to destroy her. We only had to wait for her greed to blind her to the consequences. The news of Megan's highly publicized arrest hit the financial news networks before she even reached the downtown precinct. Michael was sitting in his frozen executive suite when he saw the footage of his wife being dragged out of my building in handcuffs. The absolute reality of his complete destruction finally crushed his arrogant ego. He realized that the logistics empire was gone. The Federal Financial Crimes Network was actively building a massive money laundering case against him, and the violent offshore syndicate was still hunting for his brother-in-law Connor. Michael did what every coward does when they are hopelessly cornered. He immediately threw his wife under the bus to save his own skin. He drafted a frantic emergency press release officially disavowing Megan's actions. He publicly claimed that she had acted entirely alone in forging the routing patents and that he was completely unaware of her corporate espionage. It was a transparent, pathetic lie designed to build a legal firewall between him and his wife's impending felony convictions. Realizing that the federal authorities were closing in to seize whatever was left of the company, Michael took his next desperate step. He formally filed for emergency corporate bankruptcy, hoping the legal red tape would shield him from the unpaid fleet drivers and the frozen accounts. But legal shields cost massive amounts of money, and Michael was completely locked out of the banking system. Terrified of facing federal prosecution without top-tier criminal defense lawyers, he picked up his phone and called the one person he believed he could still manipulate. He called his mother. I listened through the encrypted audio tap as Michael begged Brenda to save him. He sobbed into the receiver, pleading with her to immediately liquidate her massive personal retirement fund. He told her it was a matter of life and death, and that he needed millions in liquid cash to post bail for Megan and retain a federal defense team before the government issued a warrant for his arrest. Brenda, completely blinded by her toxic devotion to her favored son, did not hesitate for a single second. She promised Michael she would drain every dollar she had to save him. I listened as she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, heading straight for the central bank. She had absolutely no idea she was running toward an empty vault. Brenda arrived at the towering stone facade of the premier central bank in the heart of the financial district, completely ignoring the heavy rain, soaking her expensive designer coat. I knew her exact movements because Jonathan had placed a highly classified digital tracker on her primary accounts, the very moment she handed me those divorce papers. We sat in my new executive office on the top floor of Williams' skyscraper, listening to the live audio feed. Jonathan had legally tapped through the bank's high-tier fraud prevention department. Brenda bypassed the regular customer lines and marched directly to the exclusive wealth management desk. She slammed her platinum identification card onto the polished marble counter with a sharp, entitled crack. Her voice was shaking with a frantic, unhinged urgency that I had never heard in 40 years of marriage. She demanded the teller immediately liquidate her entire portfolio, including her mutual funds, her liquid savings, and the massive retirement trust I had funded for decades. She ordered an emergency wire transfer to a private legal defense account Michael had hastily set up that very morning. She was fully prepared to burn down her entire financial future, sacrificing every single dollar she had accumulated just to save her favored son from the crushing weight of federal prosecution. She did not care that Michael had committed massive corporate fraud. She did not care that he had brutally betrayed his own father or attempted to lock me in a psychiatric ward. She only cared about preserving the illusion of her perfect family and keeping her golden child out of a federal penitentiary. Her breathing was ragged through the audio feed as she commanded the teller to expedite the process, screaming that time was running out and that she authorized whatever penalty fees the bank required for early withdrawal. The teller silently typed her credentials into the secure terminal. Through the tapped audio feed, I heard the rapid clicking of the keyboard suddenly stop. There was a long, suffocating silence in the opulent bank lobby. The teller politely asked Brenda to wait and immediately called for the senior branch manager. When the manager approached the counter, his tone was entirely devoid of the sycophantic warmth Brenda was accustomed to receiving. He informed my treacherous wife that her comprehensive retirement accounts, her personal checking lines, and her emergency savings currently displayed a balance of absolute zero. Brenda gasped loudly, her voice echoing off the marble walls, accusing the bank of a catastrophic system error. She screamed that she was a highly valued client and that she had over $12 million secured in those specific vaults. But there was no system error. Jonathan smiled coldly from his desk as the bank manager explained the brutal legal reality of her situation. When Brenda aggressively filed for an immediate divorce and weaponized the court system to freeze my assets with fake medical claims, she unwittingly triggered a mandatory reciprocal forensic discovery process. Jonathan had deployed the absolute highest tier of corporate litigators to execute a flawless countermaneuver. They traced every single dollar in her accounts directly back to my original capital investments. Because she had initiated a hostile marital dispute and falsely accused me of cognitive decline, Jonathan legally diverted, secured, and impounded all non-vested marital assets pending a comprehensive federal audit. She had tried to use the law to leave me destitute on the freezing streets. Instead, the legal trap she set had snapped violently around her own neck. Brenda was left standing in the grand lobby with absolutely nothing to her name. The wealth she thought she commanded was merely an illusion funded entirely by my labor. She had abandoned a fiercely loyal husband for a criminal son, and her ultimate reward was complete and absolute financial ruin. Brenda collapsed physically against the marble counter, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her poverty crushed her. I listened as she fumbled with her mobile phone with shaking hands and dialed Michael's private line. She choked on her own tears as she confessed that the bailout money was completely gone, locked permanently behind an impenetrable wall of federal litigation. She begged him to tell her what to do next, pleading for a plan to save them both. Michael did not offer his weeping mother a single word of comfort. He did not tell her that they would find another way, or that they would face the severe consequences together as a family. The exact second he realized the massive financial rescue was not coming, the true miserable depth of his cowardice revealed itself. He abruptly hung up the phone without saying goodbye, leaving the woman who had just tried to sacrifice her entire life for him crying alone in a public lobby. In my office, Jonathan's encrypted monitors instantly flared with new high-priority data streams. Michael was backed into an inescapable corner. His wife was sitting in a police interrogation room facing a decade for corporate espionage. His mother was entirely bankrupt. The violent offshore syndicate was actively hunting his brother-in-law, and a team of federal financial investigators was currently drafting a warrant for his immediate arrest. Michael made the ultimate cowardly choice. He opened his encrypted laptop and utilized his very last hidden offshore credit line to access a dark market aviation network. Jonathan tracked the digital footprint in real time as Michael hastily chartered a private jet under a fabricated corporate alias. His chosen destination was a remote airstrip in a country that notoriously maintained zero extradition treaties with the United States government. He was planning to abandon his arrested wife, completely discard his destitute mother, and flee the jurisdiction before the authorities could place him in handcuffs. I stood up from my leather chair and buttoned my bespoke suit jacket. I told Jonathan to contact the federal marshals and ready the armored sedan. My son thought he could simply buy his way out of consequence and fly away from the absolute devastation he had caused. He was about to find out that I controlled the skies just as much as I controlled the ground. The private aviation terminal on the outskirts of the city was completely deserted, save for the sleek jet idling heavily on the wet tarmac. I watched the live satellite feed from the passenger seat of Jonathan's armored sedan as we sped down the dark highway. Michael was pacing nervously near the boarding stairs, clutching a leather briefcase tightly to his chest. He constantly checked his mobile phone, searching frantically for any breaking news alerts about federal indictments or frozen assets. He did not look like the arrogant chief executive who had stolen my boardroom just a few days ago. He looked like a terrified, cornered animal. He had completely abandoned his wife, Megan, to rot in a downtown holding cell where she was facing decades for corporate espionage and assault. He had discarded his mother, Brenda, leaving her entirely destitute and sobbing in a public bank lobby after she tried to drain her non-existent retirement funds to save him. Michael cared about absolutely no one but his own survival. He had chartered this flight using a fabricated corporate alias and paid an exorbitant premium in untraceable cryptocurrency to bypass the standard flight logs. His destination was a remote airstrip in a country that notoriously maintained zero extradition treaties with the United States government. He truly believed he could simply buy his way out of consequence. I thought he could steal the massive logistics empire I built from a single delivery truck, plunge it into millions of dollars of toxic debt, and just fly away while his family absorbed the devastating legal fallout. The satellite feed showed him jogging up the metal stairs and disappearing into the luxurious cabin of the aircraft. The heavy cabin door sealed shut behind him. He probably poured himself a glass of top-shelf champagne, thinking he had successfully outsmarted the federal authorities and his aging father. He had absolutely no idea that Jonathan had flagged the jet's tail number with the Federal Aviation Administration. The exact second the flight plan was filed. We were less than 2 miles away, and we had brought an entire tactical unit of federal marshals with us. The massive engines of the jet whined with a deafening, high-pitched roar as the pilot prepared to taxi toward the main runway. I felt the deep vibration in my chest as our armored sedan smashed directly through the chain-link security gates of the private airfield. We were immediately flanked by 4 black government vehicles. Their red and blue strobe lights cut violently through the dark, foggy night, illuminating the pouring rain. The tactical convoy swarmed the tarmac with terrifying speed, completely surrounding the aircraft and blocking any possible path to the runway. The lead federal marshal jumped out of his vehicle with a megaphone ordering the pilot to kill the engines immediately or face lethal force. The deafening roar of the jet turbines sputtered and died, leaving a heavy ringing silence over the airfield. I stepped out of the sedan, pulling my tailored coat tight against the cold wind. A team of heavily armed federal agents rolled a mobile metal staircase up to the side of the aircraft. They breached the cabin door with a loud metallic crash that echoed across the concrete. I stood firmly on the wet tarmac and watched the raid unfold with absolute precision. Less than a minute later, Michael was forcefully dragged out of the luxurious cabin. He was not walking gracefully. Two massive federal agents had him pinned by the shoulders, hauling him down the metal stairs while he kicked and screamed in sheer blind panic. The heavy steel handcuffs were already locked tightly around his wrists. They slammed him face first against the side of a government vehicle to conduct a rapid physical search. He shrieked that there was a massive misunderstanding, claiming he was an elite corporate executive and demanding to call his lawyers immediately. The arresting officer loudly read him his rights, listing a devastating cascade of federal charges, including wire fraud, grand larceny, money laundering, and flight to avoid prosecution. Michael's expensive tailored suit was soaked with dirty rainwater and jet fuel. His arrogant, untouchable facade had been entirely violently shattered in a matter of seconds. Michael pressed his bruised cheek against the cold metal of the federal vehicle, gasping heavily for air. He turned his head and finally saw me standing just 10 feet away in the shadows of the flashing police lights. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He expected me to scream at him. He expected me to demand a tearful apology for the hostile boardroom takeover, or express my profound heartbreak over his vicious betrayal. I desperately wanted me to engage with him emotionally, so he could deploy his usual manipulations and beg for a miraculous financial bailout. I gave him absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still with my posture rigid and looked down at him with an icy, hollow silence. I stripped away every single ounce of paternal warmth I had ever offered him throughout his entire privileged life. I looked at him as if he were a complete stranger who had simply tried to steal my wallet on the street. The sheer total indifference in my eyes broke his spirit completely. He began to sob hysterically on the wet tarmac, calling me dad and pleading for a second chance as the federal marshals aggressively shoved him into the back of the armored transport. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing his fate forever and cutting off his pathetic cries. I turned my back on the vehicle and climbed into Jonathan's sedan without a second glance. Michael, Megan, and Brenda were permanently neutralized. The logistics empire they tried to steal was safe and thriving within my offshore trust. But the brutal war was not entirely over. My secure mobile phone chimed with a high-priority alert from my private security grid. My biological daughter Alyssa and her white husband Connor had realized they were the absolute last ones standing. The violent offshore syndicate debt I now legally owned had reached its absolute deadline after Connor failed to sell the waterfront estate. Desperate and terrified of the armed collectors they believed were coming for them, they had bypassed the ground floor security of my private downtown penthouse. The live surveillance feed showed them pacing nervously in my living room, waiting to beg for their lives. I told Jonathan to drive back to the city. The final reckoning had arrived. The drive back from the airfield to my downtown penthouse was silent and incredibly fast. Jonathan monitored the building's internal security feed, the entire way tracking every desperate movement my daughter and her husband made. We bypassed the ground floor entirely and took the private executive elevator directly into my residence. The heavy oak doors slid open to reveal a scene of absolute pathetic desperation. Alyssa and Connor were pacing frantically across the polished hardwood floor of my living room. They looked completely destroyed. Alyssa's expensive designer clothes were violently rumpled, and her makeup was smeared in dark streaks down her face. Connor was sweating profusely, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold a framed family photograph he had picked up from a side table. When they saw me step out of the elevator alongside Jonathan, they did not ask about Michael's arrest or Brenda's financial ruin. They immediately dropped to their knees on the floor. Alyssa crawled forward and grabbed the hem of my bespoke coat, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged me to forgive them for orchestrating the boardroom coup claiming Michael and his wife had maliciously manipulated them into voting against me. She screamed that they had made a terrible mistake and that they were currently being hunted by violent offshore collectors. Connor chimed in, his voice cracking with sheer unfiltered panic. He pleaded with me to pay off the $8 million syndicate debt, swearing they would do absolutely anything I asked to make it right. He then tried to use the ultimate emotional leverage. He cried that the syndicate collectors would not just break his legs, but that they would violently come after their 2 young children. He begged me to think of my innocent grandchildren, painting a horrific, bloody picture of their home being invaded by armed enforcers before morning. They willingly used their own kids as human shields to excuse their massive corporate theft and reckless greed. I looked down at my biological daughter and her treacherous white husband. They truly believed I was just a wealthy, soft-hearted old man who would instantly fold and write a blank check at the mere mention of his grandchildren. They had absolutely no idea I was the one holding their leash. I did not reach down to help Alyssa off the floor. I stepped back, forcing her to release my coat, and walked over to my heavy mahogany desk. I told them with surgical, unwavering clarity that true love does not finance chronic irresponsibility and toxic betrayal. I informed them that the violent offshore syndicate they were so terrified of no longer held their debt. I pulled the original printed promissory notes from my jacket pocket and dropped them onto the glass coffee table. Connor stared at the papers, his jaw dropping in sheer horror as he realized I had legally purchased their entire liability portfolio through Williams Holding Company. I was their sole undisputed creditor. Alyssa gasped loudly, a brief flash of naive hope washing over her tear-stained face. She actually thought my ownership of the debt meant they were automatically forgiven, assuming I would simply wipe the $8 million clean because we shared a history. I shattered that pathetic illusion instantly. I told her the debt remained fully active and the midnight deadline had officially passed. I was legally initiating immediate foreclosure on their historic waterfront estate and systematically seizing every remaining asset to their name to cover the principal. Connor shrieked that I was a monster, crying that I was actively leaving my own grandchildren homeless and destitute on the freezing streets. I silenced him with a single, sharp look that completely drained the air from the room. I explained that I had already taken perfect ironclad care of my grandchildren. Earlier that evening, Jonathan had finalized the creation of 2 heavily fortified, untouchable educational trusts fully funded by my offshore accounts. The trusts guaranteed the children's elite schooling, premium medical care, and secure housing until they turned 25. But the legal structure of the trusts was designed with ruthless precision to completely bypass their parents. Alyssa and Connor would not have access to a single penny of that money. They could not leverage it, they could not borrow against it, and they could not steal it to fund their lavish lifestyle. The children were completely safe and entirely provided for, but Alyssa and Connor were entirely on their own, facing total ruin. The realization hit them like a physical blow to the chest. Their ultimate emotional leverage had been surgically removed from the board. Connor realized the massive safety net he had relied on his entire privileged life was permanently gone. He looked at the promissory notes sitting on the table, then looked at the cold, unyielding expression on my face. He knew with absolute certainty that I was going to legally strip him down to nothing and let him face the brutal public consequences of his massive fraud. The sheer terror of losing his luxury cars, his elite social status, and his freedom completely broke whatever fragile, pathetic loyalty he had left for his wife. He stood up from the floor, abruptly wiping the sweat from his forehead, and physically backed away from Alyssa. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted silver flash drive. Alyssa looked up at him in total confusion, her voice shaking as she asked him what he was doing. Connor ignored her entirely and locked his desperate eyes directly on me. He offered me a cowardly, self-serving deal. He claimed that Michael and Megan did not act alone in forging the shipping route patents or orchestrating the hostile takeover. He stated that the flash drive contained months of encrypted emails, hidden audio recordings and shadow digital ledgers proving that Alyssa was intimately involved in planning the initial boardroom coup from the very beginning. He promised to hand over the flash drive right now and provide full cooperative testimony to the federal investigators, practically guaranteeing that Alyssa would go to federal prison alongside her brother. In exchange, he begged me to grant him full financial immunity, wipe his portion of the $8 million debt completely clean, and let him walk away from the family without facing criminal charges. He was willingly and eagerly selling out his own wife, the mother of his children, just to save his own skin from federal prosecution. Alyssa let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, unfiltered agony as the absolute depth of his betrayal registered in her mind. The last remaining bond in our fractured family was violently destroying itself right in front of my eyes. Alyssa let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. It was a guttural, terrifying sound of a woman watching her entire reality disintegrate. She did not just cry. She launched herself across the expensive rug and physically slammed her fists into Connor's chest. She screamed that he was a coward and a traitor. She clawed at his tailored jacket, her perfectly manicured nails tearing the fabric as she exposed the absolute, horrifying truth of their corporate treason. She yelled for everyone in the room to hear that Connor was not a victim of Michael and Megan's ambitions. He was the actual architect of the forgery. She shrieked that Connor was the one who initially approached Megan with the shadow syndicate connections. He was the one who fed Megan the specific legal loopholes required to forge my physical signature on the routing patents. Connor violently shoved Alyssa backward, sending her crashing onto the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger at her face, screaming that she had eagerly signed the syndicate loan documents because she could not bear the thought of losing her luxury cars and country club memberships. They tore each other to pieces right in front of my desk. The polished elite couple who had looked down on my blue-collar origins for a decade were now reduced to rabid animals fighting over scraps of survival. Alyssa wept hysterically, confessing that Connor had manipulated the entire timeline because his own private real estate investments were massively underwater. He needed the logistics company patents to bail out his failing portfolio. The last remaining bond in my fractured family violently destroyed itself. They were no longer a unified front against a wealthy old man. They were two desperate criminals actively competing to see who could send the other to federal prison first. Connor turned his back on his sobbing wife and held the silver flash drive out toward me. His hand was trembling so violently he nearly dropped the encrypted device. He breathed heavily, repeating his pathetic offer. He demanded I wipe his portion of the $8 million debt completely clean and grant him full financial immunity in exchange for the digital evidence of Alyssa's crimes. He actually believed he still possessed bargaining power. I walked slowly around the edge of my mahogany desk. I reached out and took the small silver drive from his sweaty palm. A wave of sickening relief washed over his pale face. He thought we had just struck a gentleman's agreement. I shattered his delusion instantly. I looked him dead in the eye and stated with absolute surgical precision that I do not negotiate with parasites. I slipped the flash drive into my jacket pocket and pointed toward the discreet, high-definition security cameras mounted perfectly in the corners of my office ceiling. I informed Connor and Alyssa that my private residence was heavily monitored with state-of-the-art audio and visual recording equipment. I told them that every single word of their vicious screaming match, every wild accusation, and every explicit confession of corporate forgery had just been captured in pristine quality. Jonathan stepped forward and tapped his tablet, immediately locking the encrypted recording file and routing it directly to our secure offshore server. Connor staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. He realized he had just handed me the murder weapon, confessed to the crime, and secured absolutely nothing in return. I instructed Jonathan to package the digital confessions alongside the encrypted contents of Connor's flash drive. We were not going to hold this evidence for leverage. I ordered Jonathan to transmit the entire unredacted dossier directly to the prosecuting district attorney's personal terminal. The rats had successfully eaten each other, and I was simply handing the exterminator the keys to the cage. The transmission of the digital evidence triggered an immediate and devastating federal response. The prosecuting attorney did not wait for the morning to act on the ironclad confessions. Within 45 minutes, the heavy oak doors of my penthouse swung open again. A team of federal agents coordinating directly with Jonathan's legal contacts marched into my living room. They did not show an ounce of hesitation or courtesy. They hauled Connor to his feet, forcefully securing his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. Alyssa remained curled on the hardwood floor, paralyzed by shock and terror, until two female agents lifted her up and read her rights. They were officially charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate espionage. I stood completely still by the grand windows, watching my biological daughter and her treacherous husband being dragged out of my home. They begged me to stop the agents, crying my name as the elevator doors slid shut, but I offered them nothing but chilling, absolute silence. The federal trap we had meticulously constructed had finally snapped fully shut. By the end of the week, the grand jury reviewed the flawless chain of evidence Jonathan and I provided. They returned sweeping indictments for the entire family. The presiding federal judge formally set the trial date, stamping it boldly onto the public judicial calendar. The news of the impending legal bloodbath leaked to the major financial networks instantly. The media eagerly prepared to broadcast the absolute spectacular destruction of Michael and Megan's fraudulent empire. There were no more shadow games, no more wiretaps, and no more secret boardroom negotiations. Everything was dragging violently into the blinding light of a federal courtroom. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, looking out over the city skyline. The war had escalated to its final stage, guaranteeing the absolute public eradication of the parasites who tried to steal my life. The federal courthouse downtown was an imposing structure of cold marble and dark mahogany. I sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table, with Jonathan and my biological father, William, flanking me. Across the center aisle sat the people who had constituted my entire existence for 38 years. Brenda, Michael, Megan. Alyssa and Connor were lined up at the defense table like condemned prisoners. The polished, elite family image they had projected to the city for a decade was completely eradicated. They looked exhausted, pale, and terrified. The prosecuting attorney did not even need to present his opening statement before their fragile alliance violently shattered. The exact moment the prosecution entered Connor's encrypted flash drive and the audio recording of their penthouse screaming match into the official court record, absolute panic took over. They realized there was no collective defense left to mount. It was a brutal race to see who could secure a plea deal first. Michael's high-priced defense attorney immediately stood up and attempted to sever his client's case from his wife's, loudly declaring that Megan had orchestrated the corporate espionage and patent forgery entirely on her own. Megan leaped out of her heavy wooden chair, slamming her hands on the defense table. She shrieked that Michael was a coward and pointed directly at Connor, screaming to the federal judge that her brother-in-law was the true architect of the Shadow Syndicate loan. Connor violently pushed his chair back and yelled that Alyssa was the one who eagerly signed the collateral documents to keep her luxury cars and country club memberships. Brenda began to sob hysterically, clutching her chest and crying out that she was just an innocent mother manipulated by her greedy children. The federal judge struck his gavel repeatedly, threatening to hold them all in contempt of court and have them removed in restraints. It was a spectacular, pathetic implosion. They were viciously tearing each other to pieces in open court, hurling wild accusations and desperate confessions in front of a packed gallery of reporters and federal investigators. I sat perfectly still, watching the people who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward destroy their own lives to save their own skin. The courtroom finally settled into a tense, suffocating silence when the prosecution called me to the witness stand. I walked past the defense table, without offering them a single glance. I wore the same bespoke charcoal suit I had worn to crash Megan's fraudulent corporate gala. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down facing the jury box. The defense attorneys were visibly sweating. They expected an angry, bitter old man they could easily paint as erratic, confused, or vengeful. I gave them absolutely nothing to work with. I delivered my testimony with surgical, unwavering precision. I did not speak about my broken heart or the 40 years of marriage Brenda had discarded so easily. I spoke exclusively in numbers, dates, and certified legal actions. Guided by the prosecuting attorney, I methodically laid out the exact timeline of their grand larceny. I detailed the morning they executed the hostile boardroom takeover. I presented the notarized federal medical affidavit that permanently dismantled their fake dementia injunction. I walked the jury through the exact offshore routing numbers Michael used to leverage my company to the Cayman Syndicate. Jonathan had provided a flawless, impenetrable paper trail. Every single word I spoke was immediately backed by a high-definition projection of bank receipts, forged patent transfers, and time-stamped security footage. When I detailed how Brenda had illegally frozen my retirement accounts while trying to drain them days later to fund Michael's escape flight, she buried her face in her hands and wailed. The defense attorneys tried to cross-examine me, attempting to find a single crack in my memory or a shred of hesitation they could exploit. I shut them down with chilling, absolute clarity. I cited specific corporate bylaws they had violated and exact financial codes they had breached. I left them with absolutely no room to manipulate the narrative. I was not a victim seeking sympathy. I was the architect of their destruction, laying out the blueprints of their crimes. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, the jury was staring at the defense table with undisguised disgust. The federal trial lasted less than 2 weeks, but the jury deliberations took barely 4 hours. The overwhelming mountain of unredacted evidence combined with their own vicious courtroom confessions left absolutely no room for reasonable doubt. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open, and the jurors filed into their seats with grim, resolute expressions. The foreman stood up and handed the verdict sheets to the bailiff. The silence in the federal courtroom was absolute. Brenda trembled so violently, her defense attorney had to hold her by the arm to keep her upright. The judge read the verdicts aloud, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Guilty on all charges. Michael and Megan were convicted of major corporate espionage, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Connor and Alyssa were found guilty of federal conspiracy and bank fraud tied to the offshore syndicate debt. Brenda was convicted of perjury and financial extortion. The judge did not show an ounce of leniency. He handed down heavy consecutive federal prison sentences, stripping away their remaining assets to pay mandatory criminal restitution. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs filled the room as federal marshals moved in. Michael tried to look back at me one last time, his eyes wide with sheer unfiltered terror, as the reality of a decade in a federal penitentiary finally crushed his arrogant ego. I did not return his gaze. I watched with hollow satisfaction as the marshals escorted my former family through the side doors, dragging them away to begin their sentences. The reporters quickly rushed out to broadcast the spectacular downfall of their fraudulent empire to the national networks. Within minutes, the massive courtroom was completely empty. The prosecuting attorneys packed their briefcases and nodded to me respectfully before departing. I stood up from the gallery bench and smoothed the front of my suit jacket. I stood entirely alone in this quiet aisle, surrounded by the heavy oak pews and the lingering echo of the judge's gavel. I had won the war definitively. I had systematically eradicated the parasites who tried to steal my existence. But as I walked toward the heavy exit doors to meet William and Jonathan, I realized the external battle was over, and I was stepping into a profoundly altered reality. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse and stepped out into the biting chill of the late afternoon air. The deafening echo of the judge striking his gavel and handing down decades of prison time to my former family still rang in my ears. I stood at the top of the sprawling marble steps looking down at the busy city streets. Jonathan and my biological father, William, walked quietly beside me. They did not crowd me or offer unnecessary words of comfort. They understood the profound gravity of the moment. We descended the steps and climbed into the waiting armored sedan in absolute silence. The heavy doors sealed shut, locking out the noise of the traffic and the flashing cameras of the remaining press. I sank into the deep leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. The external war was definitively over. The legal battles were won. The fraudulent empire Michael and Megan tried to build had been crushed into dust. Connor and Alyssa were facing the brutal reality of a federal penitentiary. Brenda was entirely bankrupt and completely alone. I had systematically eradicated the parasites who had tried to steal my life. But as the sedan merged onto the highway, I was forced to navigate the massive internal resolution of my altered reality. I closed my eyes and processed the sheer magnitude of the devastation. I had spent 38 years operating under the assumption that Brenda, Michael, and Alyssa were the only anchors I had in this world. I woke up in that state hospital at 32 years old with severe amnesia, a blank slate with absolutely no history. I poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and ambition into building a flawless life for them. I believed I was constructing a generational legacy. Now that entire family structure had been legally and physically erased from my existence. I was a husband without a wife and a father without children. Society dictates that a man in my position should feel entirely hollow, crushed by the tragic loss of his loved ones. But as I sat in the quiet cabin of the sedan, I searched my soul for grief and found absolutely nothing but clean, empty space. I did not feel hollow. I felt liberated. The people I sent to prison were not my family. They were highly sophisticated predators who had worn the masks of my wife and children until my utility expired. I accepted this new reality with absolute, unyielding peace. The surgery to remove them had been brutal and bloody, but the toxic cancer was permanently gone. I opened my eyes and looked across the vehicle at William. The 92-year-old billionaire stared back at me with a look of profound mutual understanding. We had both lost decades of our lives to that catastrophic train derailment. We could not rewrite the past, but we possessed the limitless power to dictate the future. The transition from destruction to creation happened with breathtaking speed. I did not spend my days sitting in an empty mansion, dwelling on the betrayal. I had an empire to rebuild, and I was doing it alongside the father I had searched for my entire life. William and I formally merged our vast resources. We combined the limitless clean capital of his shadow holdings with the operational brilliance of my logistics syndicate. But we did not channel our billions into standard corporate acquisitions or bloated tech buyouts. We directed our massive wealth entirely toward urban renewal and aggressive community empowerment. We purchased massive tracts of abandoned industrial land in the most neglected, forgotten sectors of the city. These were neighborhoods plagued by systemic poverty and entirely abandoned by municipal investors. We brought in fleets of construction crews and transformed the decaying manufacturing plants into state-of-the-art regional shipping and logistics hubs. We were not just building warehouses. We were constructing economic fortresses designed to directly benefit the marginalized communities living in their shadows. Jonathan executed those legal frameworks with his usual ruthless efficiency. We established an irrevocable corporate charter that guaranteed profit sharing for every single worker who loaded a truck, managed a route, or maintained an engine on our properties. We stripped away the predatory corporate models that exploited blue-collar labor and replaced them with structures that generated genuine generational wealth for our employees. We created massive vocational academies right next to our shipping hubs. I personally designed the curriculum to train young African-American men and women who had been entirely discarded by the traditional educational system. We paid them a living wage simply to attend the classes. We taught them advanced supply chain management, global freight routing, heavy diesel mechanics, and executive leadership. I walked the floors of the academies every single morning, watching these young people devour the opportunities we provided. I looked into their eyes and saw the exact same raw, hungry ambition I possessed when I bought my first delivery truck 38 years ago. They did not carry the sickening, toxic entitlement that had poisoned my biological children. They understood the value of hard work because they had survived the brutal reality of having absolutely nothing. William and I spent our evenings in the executive boardroom reviewing architectural blueprints and national expansion strategies. We did not share sentimental, tearful moments about the decades we lost. Our bond was forged entirely in action and mutual respect. We communicated through the massive structural changes we were forcing upon the world. One evening, as we reviewed the finalized deed for a new commercial training facility, William poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon. He slid a glass across the polished mahogany table and looked at me with a fierce, uncompromising pride. He told me that a man's true legacy is not defined by the ungrateful children who inherit his bank accounts. A true legacy is defined by the permanent, immovable structures he leaves behind to elevate his people. We drank our bourbon in comfortable silence, surrounded by the digital maps of the cities we were rebuilding. I realized in that quiet moment that I was no longer a man without a past. I was firmly rooted in a powerful bloodline of builders and survivors. We were utilizing our immense wealth as a precision weapon to dismantle systemic poverty and replace it with unbreakable economic foundations. Every single dollar Michael and Megan had tried to steal to fund their lavish, empty lifestyles was now actively paying the mortgages of thousands of hardworking families. The ultimate revenge against my treacherous family was not just sending them to federal prison. It was taking the exact empire they desperately coveted and giving it away freely to people who actually deserved it. A year after the federal trial concluded, I stood alone in my new corporate headquarters. I occupied the entire top floor of a towering glass skyscraper situated directly in the heart of the financial district. I walked away from my heavy oak desk and stepped out onto the massive open-air balcony. The crisp morning wind swept across my face as I looked down at the sprawling city skyline. Far below me, in the industrial sectors, I could see the distinct white and gold transport trucks of my new logistics syndicate, moving steadily along the highway arteries. They were carrying freight across the country, driven by men and women who owned a legitimate stake in the company they worked for. I placed my hands on the cold steel railing and surveyed the empire I had built from the ashes of my old life. I was 70 years old, but I did not feel like a man nearing the end of his journey. I felt completely reborn. The toxic parasitic elements that had quietly drained my energy for 4 decades had been surgically permanently removed. I no longer had to sleep with one eye open, wondering when the knife was going to slide into my back. There were no more fake smiles at the dinner table. There were no more forged documents hidden in private safes. The structural integrity of my existence was absolutely flawless. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged with my mind, my wealth, and my true father entirely intact. The silence on the balcony was profound and powerful. It was not the silence of defeat or isolation. It was the sound of a perfectly calibrated machine operating exactly as intended. Order was completely restored. I pushed through the heavy doors of the federal courthouse and stepped out into the biting chill of the afternoon air. The deafening echo of the judge striking his gavel and handing down decades of prison time to my former family rang in my ears. I stood at the top of the marble steps looking at the busy city streets. Jonathan and my biological father, William, walked quietly beside me. They did not crowd me or offer unnecessary words of comfort. They understood the profound gravity of the moment. We descended the steps and climbed into the armored sedan in absolute silence. The heavy doors sealed shut, locking out the noise of traffic and the flashing cameras of the press. I sank into the leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. The external war was definitively over. The legal battles were won. The fraudulent empire Michael and Megan tried to build was crushed into dust. Connor and Alyssa faced the brutal reality of a federal penitentiary. Brenda was entirely bankrupt and alone. I had systematically eradicated the parasites who had tried to steal my life. As the sedan merged onto the highway, I navigated the internal resolution of my altered reality. I closed my eyes and processed the devastation. I had spent 38 years operating under the assumption that Brenda, Michael, and Alyssa were my only anchors. I woke up in that state hospital at 32 years old with severe amnesia and absolutely no history. I poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and ambition into building a flawless life for them. I believed I was constructing a generational legacy. Now that entire family structure had been legally and physically erased. I was a husband without a wife and a father without children. Society dictates that a man in my position should feel entirely hollow, crushed by the tragic loss of his loved ones. But as I sat in the sedan, I searched my soul for grief and found absolutely nothing but clean, empty space. I felt liberated. The people I sent to prison were not my family. They were highly sophisticated predators who wore masks until my utility expired. I accepted this new reality with absolute unyielding peace. The surgery to remove them had been brutal, but the cancer was gone. I opened my eyes and looked at William. The 92-year-old billionaire stared back at me with profound mutual understanding. We had both lost decades of our lives to that catastrophic train derailment. We could not rewrite the past, but we possessed the limitless power to dictate the future. The transition from destruction to creation happened with breathtaking speed. I did not spend my days sitting in an empty mansion, dwelling on the betrayal. I had an empire to rebuild, and I was doing it alongside the father I had searched for my entire life. William and I formally merged our vast resources. We combined the limitless clean capital of his shadow holdings with the operational brilliance of my logistics syndicate. We directed our massive wealth entirely toward urban renewal and aggressive community empowerment. We purchased massive tracts of abandoned industrial land in the most neglected sectors of the city. These were neighborhoods plagued by poverty and abandoned by municipal investors. We brought in fleets of construction crews and transformed the decaying manufacturing plants into state-of-the-art regional shipping and logistics hubs. We were not just building warehouses. We were constructing economic fortresses designed to directly benefit the marginalized communities living in their shadows. Jonathan executed the legal frameworks with his usual ruthless efficiency. We established an irrevocable corporate charter that guaranteed profit sharing for every single worker who loaded a truck, managed a route, or maintained an engine on our properties. We stripped away the predatory corporate models that exploited blue-collar labor and replaced them with structures that generated genuine generational wealth for our employees. We created massive vocational academies right next to our shipping hubs. I personally designed the curriculum to train young African-American men and women who had been entirely discarded by the educational system. We paid them a living wage simply to attend the classes. We taught them advanced supply chain management, global freight routing, heavy diesel mechanics, and executive leadership. I walked the floors of the academies every single morning, watching these young people devour the opportunities we provided. I looked into their eyes and saw the exact same raw, hungry ambition I possessed when I bought my first delivery truck 38 years ago. They did not carry the sickening, toxic entitlement that had poisoned my biological children. They understood the value of hard work because they had survived the brutal reality of having absolutely nothing. William and I spent our evenings in the executive boardroom reviewing architectural blueprints and national expansion strategies. Our bond was forged entirely in action and mutual respect. We communicated through the massive structural changes we were forcing upon the world. One evening, as we reviewed the finalized deed for a new commercial training facility, William poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon. He slid a glass across the polished mahogany table and looked at me with a fierce, uncompromising pride. He told me that a man's true legacy is not defined by the ungrateful children who inherit his bank accounts. A true legacy is defined by the permanent, immovable structures he leaves behind to elevate his people. We drank our bourbon in comfortable silence, surrounded by the digital maps of the cities we were rebuilding. I realized in that quiet moment that I was no longer a man without a past. I was firmly rooted in a powerful bloodline of builders and survivors. We were utilizing our immense wealth as a precision weapon to dismantle systemic poverty and replace it with unbreakable economic foundations. Every single Michael and Megan had tried to steal to fund their lavish lifestyles was now actively paying the mortgages of hardworking families. The ultimate revenge against my treacherous family was not just sending them to federal prison. It was taking the exact empire they desperately coveted and giving it away freely to people who actually deserved it. As I navigated this new chapter, I learned another profound lesson that I will carry with me until my final breath. I learned that loyalty is not automatically inherited simply because you share a roof or a last name with someone. True loyalty is a conscious, daily choice, validated entirely by consistent actions. For 38 years, I blindly trusted the people sitting at my dinner table because society conditions us to believe family is inherently sacred. I ignored the subtle disrespect, the quiet entitlement, and the escalating greed because I wanted desperately to maintain the illusion of a perfect home. I learned the hard way that blind trust is a fatal vulnerability. You must evaluate the people in your life based on how they treat you when you are no longer useful to their immediate ambitions. The moment Brenda, Michael, and Alyssa believed my corporate utility had expired, they discarded me without hesitation. They taught me that the most dangerous enemies are never the rival executives in competing boardrooms. The most dangerous enemies are the ones who know exactly where you sleep and have copies of the keys to your front door. Protecting your peace requires absolute, ruthless boundaries. You cannot negotiate with people who view your existence as a disposable resource. You must cut them out surgically, permanently, and without a single shred of apology. A year after the federal trial concluded, I stood alone in my new corporate headquarters. I occupied the entire top floor of a towering glass skyscraper, situated directly in the heart of the financial district. I walked away from my heavy oak desk and stepped out onto the massive open-air balcony. The crisp morning wind swept across my face as I looked down at the sprawling city skyline. Far below me, in the industrial sectors, I could see the distinct white and gold transport trucks of my new logistics syndicate, moving steadily along the highway arteries. They were carrying freight across the country, driven by men and women who owned a legitimate stake in the company they worked for. I placed my hands on the cold steel railing and surveyed the empire I had built from the ashes of my old life. I was 70 years old, but I felt completely reborn. The toxic, parasitic elements that had quietly drained my energy for 4 decades had been surgically permanently removed. I no longer had to sleep with one eye open, wondering when the knife was going to slide into my back. There were no more fake smiles at the dinner table. There were no more forged documents hidden in private safes. The structural integrity of my existence was absolutely flawless. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged with my mind, my wealth, and my true father entirely intact. The silence on the balcony was profound and powerful. It was the sound of a perfectly calibrated machine operating exactly as intended. Order was completely restored. Did you like my story? Which exact city are you currently listening from? Let us meet and chat down in the comments. Support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much. I look forward to your comments. On the screen, you can easily see 2 new stories I highly recommend. Please subscribe, and I will definitely see you next time.